Welcome, everybody. It is Friday, March 5th, 2021. So happy Friday, number one. We're really excited to be with you today for the second entry in our monthly series that we are calling Reader Corner, where Indivisible TX Lege organizers pick a book to read for the month. And then we join on the live session to share our experience of reading that book and just thoughts of how it impacts our work in Texas and everything around it. So this book that we're going to talk about today was actually our selection for February, Intimations by Zadie Smith. Yes, everyone have their copy? So unfortunately, though, with the Texas freeze, which will be a part of will come up in this conversation, no doubt. We pushed our live session back a week just to give everyone time to, recover from that event and all the implications from it. And so we're really excited to be with you. Excited to be joined by this amazing panel of Indivisible TX Lege organizers. We have Lauren Ortel, who serves as the Indivisible National statewide organizer, as well as a criminal justice huddle lead. Lauren, great to see you. We have Antoinette Perez, who is a part of the amazing Indivisible TX Lege Leads group and does so much amazing stuff to keep everything, all the glue, keeping it all together. Kirk Pate is one of our huddle leaders for the Democracy Huddle, and Vanessa McDougall is our Immigration Huddle lead. Good morning, all. How are y'all doing?
Good.
Very well, thank you.
Excellent.
Doing well.
Looking forward to it.
Well, we're going to jump into this conversation, and the first thing that we're going to talk about is we picked a very different book from our first book, which Cast was a very in-depth, research-driven, so many references book. And for February, we picked a much thinner book, a collection of essays. And so with the approach of this book and this kind of collection of thoughts and different experiences and referencing them, this was written during the midst of the pandemic and the first half of the pandemic that we are still currently in. What was y'all's thoughts or just this particular format of the book? What did y'all think about it, and how did it impact you when you were reading it?
I'll start. Zadie Smith is an author whose novels had come up in book club circles in years prior, and I had never made any of her novels a priority. So when I read that this collection of essays was being published last year, I jumped on it because I wanted something very bite-sized. And I personally really enjoy essays by lots of different authors. So I was excited about it. I think one of the things I appreciated most about this one quality is that it is deeply personal, and essays should be. I love essays and how skilled writers can draw connections between very disparate topics. She does it very beautifully in some of these essays, and some of them stuck out. So I know we'll talk about specifics in just a few minutes.
Yeah, for me, I found it helpful to just kind of step into her mind as someone who is also experiencing this. We're at a year now of the pandemic, and it really shifts the way that we take in a lot of writing. So, I read a lot, novels, nonfiction, all kinds of things. And it's interesting how starkly different it is, the world of how things worked before we were in a pandemic, and how that shows up in writing a lot that acknowledges the pandemic and that helps you kind of process it. So I kind of see this as her processing the different aspects of the pandemic and also how it affects different people in different ways, which is really significant. So for me, it was just something that I felt like I needed, and I'm grateful that it exists.
Yeah, I thought it was really interesting the way she kept going back and forth between sort of the personal and detailed, and then the the political and the big picture and tying those together. And I thought that was the way she pulled that together. I thought was really interesting.
I kind of look at it from two perspectives, both of which she offered to us. One is simply the title, Intimations. That's a suggestion or sign that something is likely to happen. And the likely to happen is the new dawn that emerges with the pandemic and everybody's response to it. The other is she describes her writing as talking to herself being useful, and writing it down means overhearing herself. Well, when we're reading this, we are in effect overhearing her talking to herself. And so I think she discloses to us what the style is. So she's anticipating something to happen. And she's also telling us that she's listening to herself, she's talking to herself, she's writing it down, meaning she's overhearing herself, and then she's offering it to us in a written form so that we can overhear her talking to herself. So that's kind of how I describe the style. It's talking and listening to yourself and then communicating it to others through the written word.
I really like that, Kirk, and everything everyone said. It feels like what came to my mind as I was reading is just like it's a snapshot in time of someone's experience, and it just happens to be a shared experience that we can all understand and connect to. And so there's this aspect of almost like having someone's journal. It's maybe a little bit more structured than if you journal, or if you're used to journaling. It has a little bit more structure than that. But then also made me think of like finding messages in a bottle. That there's that whole thing of people putting messages in a bottle, and if whoever gets it, you experience what's happening at that point in time that they did that. But it wasn't something foreign. It was, like I said, something that we could relate to. And so everything that she was invoking and everything that she was talking about made me reflect on my own experience and made me reflect on my own thoughts in these different spaces. And so just really, really powerful when great writers take the time to do something like this that is in the now and in the present. So highly recommend. I think everyone here highly recommends if you're looking for a book. It's a fairly short read. You could probably do it in one sitting if you choose to, maybe a couple evenings if you want to, or if you wanted to have each essay as kind of your daily routine, you finish it within a week probably. And so really, really great content, which is what we're going to drive into now. And so Kirk, I'm going to hand it off to you because we've picked a group of the essays that we really want to dive into and talk about. And Kirk's going to kick us off with our first one.
The first essay is titled The American Exception. And the author leads off with a quote from Donald Trump in March of 2020. The quote is, "We had the greatest economy that we've ever had, and we didn't have death." Now, the old life that he's referring to, where the economy was greatest, is contrasted with a new dawn. And so how do you all think, how does she frame this relationship between the old being the prior great economy when we didn't have death, but yet now we have the pandemic and we have a new dawn? Can you all flesh that out some? Finding a new dawn through this disaster.
Sure. So, I mean, it really speaks to ignorance, the idea that we didn't have death and that we had a good, it was a good time. There was this old life where things were so nice, the good old days. That's never been true for most people in this country, especially the people who were originally on this land and had it stolen from them. So I think Zadie Smith is doing a good job of just kind of calling out that misconception that, we shouldn't want to go back to the way things were before the pandemic, because there was a lot of harm, a lot of death, a lot of suffering. We should push for this new dawn for a better future than we've ever seen before. So I just appreciate that she's pointing that out, that we shouldn't want to go back.
And there is a randomness to who the virus hits that I think we're not used to in this country. We're used to, I guess, you know, it's surprising when you hear about somebody passing who's not extremely old, but you know, this virus, it can hit young, healthy people really hard, and it can, you know, and there are older people who with comorbidities who recover just fine, and that randomness, I think, is really strange to us.
I really love book clubs because I think they highlight how differently we take the content. And for me, I actually got kind of the opposite, Vanessa, to where I remembered her saying all that this virus did was to lay bare the inequities and the persistent, like, hierarchical damage, and that even the virus is affecting communities of color more than it is others, poor people more than others. Like, the same pattern keeps playing out. And I just thought that was even just a clever title for this essay, because what I thought she said initially, or what I thought was written, was American exceptionalism, not the American exception.
Mm-hmm.
And that play on words was one that I think I had kind of in the back of my mind as I read the essay. And I kept trying to touch back on that change in word there, that change in expectation that I had.
In what two ways did she, to pick up on that, Antoinette, in what two ways did she talk about the American exception?
Mm.
She first talked about it related to sort of immunity from worldwide plagues. But then she turned around and talked about us being the exception given the way we responded to it. So can you all elaborate on what she was getting at there? So we're an exception in two different senses is what I'm saying. So flesh that out a little bit.
Oh, no one's jumping in. It looks like a couple of people are going to start talking, so I want to make sure. Vanessa, it looks like you wanted to jump in there.
No.
Okay.
Alex, do you want to go for this?
Yeah, I think it really. I don't know. So much of what has been shared, like Antoinette said, I love what's being shared because of the different perspectives. And Vanessa, when you said what you said, I almost took it away as we haven't expected. We expect certain people to suffer in our country, and we expect certain people to have to be burdened. Going back to that caste system mentality that we talked about last month, like there's this expectation, and when we go to Kirk, your question around the American exception and how we have handled this, and how poorly we have handled this, there's unfortunate one perspective where there's a form of pride in terms of wanting to handle it differently, and then, you know, climbing the mountaintop and say, you know, I survived this as an individual, but not understanding the collective suffering that is being caused in our country and the amount of loss that we're going to have to endure and maybe not really understand moving forward. And just that approach and how leadership makes an impact on how we approach something like this, and how unfortunate our country has had to suffer and be in the public sphere and in the highlight of the world around, you know, we're almost becoming a cautionary tale, is what our exception is allowing us to be. So.
Mm-hmm. In what couple of ways do you think, though, that we were not exceptional? What did she describe in there that gets to our lack of exceptionalism? in the way that we responded. One of those, let me give you a hint, one of those tied back to what Antoinette said about the lingering caste system. And the other was money. How money frames the response. So in those senses, were we exceptional or unexceptional?
I guess it depends on who we're comparing ourselves to. You know, I think we typically compare ourselves to other wealthy democratic countries who had wildly different responses to this and also significantly different death rates. Part of what you might be getting at is in the end, her final two sentences I found really powerful. As Americans never tire of arguing, there may be many areas of our lives in which private interest plays the central role. But as post-war Europe, exhausted by absolute death, collectively decided healthcare shouldn't be one of them. So people have already learned that we shouldn't let go of healthcare, of these basic needs of keeping people alive in sacrifice for private interest, for the individualism that our country has been based on for a long time. So I think that's just, you know, one of the American exception is like, oh, you know, we're going to take all of this death because we're going to still be independent. We're going to still have some people who do really well. Think of the people who, Jeff Bezos and other people who have made so much money off of this. And that's the American way. You know, let's celebrate the billionaires who are just raking in more money from this death and suffering. So that's kind of part of what I'm picking up that might be connected to your question.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and using England's response to World War II is very interesting because when we talk about, you know, old life, when we hear the term back to normal, you know, I think a lot of us are like, well, normal wasn't great. I don't want to go back to normal. And England had that response post World War II. It's like, I don't want to go to pre-World War II. That wasn't fantastic either because of the way the world was at the time. And so this new dawn of like saying, okay, we're going to implement universal healthcare as a way of coping with the amount of suffering that has happened during these, you know, the last several years, if not decades for that country. And this is the opportunity that we have in America, whereas, you know, it's going to be us, the people who push for that, because we have leaders in Texas like Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick who want to say, well, grandmothers should be willing to sacrifice. Grandmothers want to die for the economy to be great. And that mentality and that emphasis on economy and money, like you're referencing here, Kirk, is something that we cannot tolerate. I think it's really important for us to understand, like, there needs to be a new dawn. There needs to be this new future for us. To go through all of this and to just revert backwards would be a huge, just mistake's not even the right word. It would just be unconscionable.
Mm-hmm. One last comment here, or pose a question to you. She mentioned the word inversion that took place. What were the couple of forms of the inversion that she talked about? One having to do with all of a sudden the recognition of what the benefits of universal health care would be. And the other is vital workers, key workers, critical workers, all of a sudden were elevated above everybody else. First responders, people in restaurants, people in nursing homes, street cleaners. So the crisis itself inverted our thinking about what was really valuable, is what she was referring to. So did you all also pick up on that and a light bulb come on that, you know, as to what she was referring to there? Anybody?
I think that was unfortunately a short-lived sentiment. We did have a lot of pride and support of essential workers for maybe a few weeks. And then we seemed to stop caring and stop valuing their lives, which should never have been about what their jobs were in the first place. So I think I noticed this in the beginning, and then I've already seen it just kind of revert back to, you know, a lot of those folks, they're not even first in line. People who work in grocery stores, what a dangerous place to be working and to not have a choice. You know, you don't get paid to stay home if you work for a grocery store. And then to now see that it's like, well, you know, business. So good luck. Hopefully people will do the right thing and wear masks, but we know some of them won't. And, you know, to not even give them the vaccines first. I mean, there are a lot of people that need to get it first, but yeah, I think that sentiment was definitely shorter than it should have been in recognizing.
Mhm. Mhm.
I think there's amazing relevance. Oh, go ahead, Vanessa.
Yeah, because this book was written last summer when the idea of 2 weeks to flatten the curve was still, we were just realizing it's going to be a lot more than 2 weeks to flatten the curve. And when it was brief, it was there was more of a feeling of solidarity of, okay, I can let my hair grow out for a little while, I can stop going out to eat for a little while to flatten the curve. And then as weeks turn into months, and now we're coming up on a year, the novelty of I'm gonna cut my kid's hair in the backyard wore all the way off. And it was like, well, if I have to do this for months and months, then I'm not interested, and those people need to get back to work. You guys remember all those protests at state capitals of reopen Michigan or reopen Texas? We had one here in Texas, and the signs people had were all things like, I need a haircut, and I want to go out to eat. Nobody was protesting for the right to cut hair or to wait tables. They wanted to be waited on.
Yeah, and there's just a couple of other essays that I think are going to touch on some of the things we're touching on here now. But the last thing I'd like to share is just the amazing relevance of this conversation we're having today, while partners, organizers from our group, Coalition of Texas Organizations today, are advocating for Medicaid expansion in Texas, and how that is an unfortunate exception that we have in Texas, that we have not expanded Medicaid. And being in the middle of a pandemic, there's people who are going to be working all day long today. You can check out our page, join those efforts, join those events, because Medicaid expansion is not actually a cost. It's been always put into the perspective of like, well, this is too much of a cost, and it's actually going to save Texas money. But our inability to accept that, because of this mentality we have in not only in America, but especially in Texas around, we go it alone. We saw that with the electric grid catastrophe, we go it alone and all this kind of stuff. And that is causing too much suffering here, where we can have a new dawn. We can have Medicaid expansion in Texas. Our economy can benefit from it. We can get more resources in our state, and people can have access to healthcare that have not had it traditionally. And so this is that opportunity. And so it just feels very relevant what we're talking about today, and that work being done today as well with fighting for Medicaid expansion.
Mm-hmm.
All right, we're going to move to our next essay, and I think we have Vanessa is going to lead us to talk about the next essay.
Yes. So this was from the Something to Do essay, and there was a quote that I really liked from it. One of the radical political possibilities of our new revelatory expanse of free time is that it might create a collective demand to reassess and reconfigure as a society how we protect the rights of those whose work exists only in the present moment, without security or protection against unknown futures, especially sick leave. And of course, that ties right into Medicaid expansion in Texas. Yeah, that a lot of, most of these customer facing roles are are hourly and don't have paid sick leave and don't have any healthcare coverage. And, I think the people who run this state don't like to think about it this way, but we are all in this together. If you're not safe, I'm not safe. And if people don't have sick leave and they don't have health care, it creates a perverse incentive. If you wake up with a fever, take some Tylenol and get to work because there's bills to pay. And we're all less safe when you create those perverse incentives.
I kind of like the way she talked about the something to do thing, where she contrasted an artist who basically plies the trade alone,
Mm-hmm.
sometimes lonely, and the rest of us who don't have that type of occupation found ourselves with a lot of time on our hands. And so what is the something that we now do with all that time on our hands being at home?
Mm-hmm.
And there was a lot of reflective time is what happened. And so it leads to some of the kind of things you're talking about, Vanessa, about thinking about other possibilities.
Mm-hmm. And I do not think it's a coincidence that the Black Lives Matter protests happened last summer, and not the summer before that or before that. I think a lot of people had more time to reflect, and some of them used that time to think about police brutality and other racial inequities. And they were also able to protest without missing work because a lot of people weren't able to go to work as normal last summer.
One of the other things that sort of struck me, though, about the something to do is how so many people, the something to do for them was the same thing that they contend with in everyday life and had even before the panic. And that was earning a living, buying food, providing for medical care somehow. So the something to do in that sense stuck with them. It didn't go away. It was exacerbated by the crisis. Yeah. And so they had more time to try to endure that sort of suffering is what it amounted to.
Yeah, I have two boys, and I could not relate at all to people with no children talking about, I just don't know how I'm going to fill all these hours. My work lends itself to working from home. So I still had my job, and I was facilitating my kids' distance learning, and they never went to play with friends or, to extracurriculars or anything. And a lot of the ways I had to sort of spend money to get time, like getting takeout food, were no longer available, and I was extremely busy. Yeah, and I remember that being, especially earlier on, that was a very strange dichotomy of people who just did not have enough hours in the day and people who didn't know what to do with themselves.
I have a comment on this that I think might actually transition to the next one. So I just wanted, if I'm lucky, I'll make a comment that will transition us there. If not, we'll just get stuck and someone's going to have to pull me out. I started reading a book last summer called How to Do Nothing. And the author is named Jenny Odell. I cannot remember why I stopped reading it. Something else came up and took its place, but I read maybe half of it. Okay.
Oh, got it.
Alex has it. Alex has it. And I finished it recently, like January, February of this year. Did you read the whole thing, I
got like the last 40 pages to go.
Okay. There's a lot to that. I don't think it'll ever be a book club pick for this group necessarily, but some of the overlapping themes in that, Jenny Odell says that doing nothing can be maybe our most radical form of resistance right now in a world that prioritizes productivity and action and results and all of those things that Zadie Smith talks about in this essay. One thing that I caught at the end of this essay that I thought, there were so many things about Intimations that I felt called out on. I didn't just feel seen and understood, like I felt called out. And she talked about how when the pandemic first hit, many of us that were in that habit of just constant motion kept finding things to stay in constant motion for. Those of us that were used to having some sort of external structure to fit ourselves into now had nothing but endless amounts of time, and that we were busy trying to find things to fit ourselves into. And that ultimately, and she credits another author, Otessa Moshfegh, who's one of her novels, My Year of Rest and Relaxation, was one of the most mind-bending things I had read several years ago. She credits her essay with a quote about how without love, everything else is just filling the time. And so I really appreciated both the comments, Vanessa and Kirk, that you made earlier in this section of the discussion, that there's so much more time for reflection because you can only bake so much bread. You can only play so many video games. And at a certain point, you turn inward and you reflect a little bit. And maybe those kinds of things help us to expand our capacity for love and to choose to go out into the street and mask up and protest abuses of power, right? I love all of that. And to your point, Vanessa, that, for some of us with kids, I'm going to go ahead and now transition over into this other essay that we're going to talk about next called Suffering Like Mel Gibson. And I love a good Mel Gibson joke. I don't know who doesn't at this point. I'm going to go ahead and screen share so that we can capture this for the discussion. Eventually in this essay, Zadie Smith centers this meme that came out right after we went into lockdown, into quarantine. And it's basically Mel Gibson. He's the director on the set of, I think, The Passion of the Christ. And so his actor, who's playing Jesus Christ, obviously in, one of the bloodiest, most gory scenes, Mel Gibson's giving him notes, but the meme says, this is what it looks like when your child-free friends explain how tough it is doing lockdown alone. And my big takeaways from this particular essay were that privilege and suffering are not the same, and that privilege is a bubble that can be burst, and that people, when they get their privilege bubble burst, can experience a sense of return to a perspective that maybe they were missing before. Whereas suffering is not a bubble that can be burst. And I actually read into this essay, particularly toward the end, that regardless of where we are in the pandemic, regardless of what the privileges are that we enjoy, we also need to honor our own sense of suffering because it is real for us. And she even, again, like feeling called out and totally seen, she said, how many Zooms have you been in where you see 12 different faces, grainy images of your friends, and they ask you, how are you doing? And you say, I'm really lucky. I have a roof over my head. We have food to eat, all these things. My suffering is nothing compared to what's happening out there. I said that every day, every day. And I felt like she was really encouraging all of us to acknowledge whatever the challenges are, because for us, they are real. And we may be experiencing those challenges in a bubble of privilege, and they're still real for us. I don't know if any of you had similar or different thoughts, but I'd love to hear your takeaways on this essay.
Well, I like your reference to the bubbles. A privilege bubble is something that you can poke through that bubble when you have privilege. And privilege often means lots of money. Those who are in the suffering bubble don't have the means to poke through that bubble. Their suffering continues. The suffering that began before the pandemic continues now, except maybe in a an exacerbated form even. So when you're in the suffering bubble, you don't have the opportunity, the resources, the capacity, the wherewithal to work your way out of that bubble and to alleviate yourself like people do in the privilege bubble. And so I thought that was a good analogy. And yeah, thanks for bringing that up, Antoinette. Yeah.
This essay was really challenging for me because it is, the way you were describing how we compare our suffering and how some of us, even though we have shelter, we have food, things like that, we can still be suffering in ways. But I couldn't help, my mind kept going back to thinking about so many examples. One example is a group in Austin called Save Austin Now that during the pandemic has dedicated themselves to going out, risking, spreading the virus, to going up to people and getting them to sign something that will get recriminalizing homelessness back into Austin's laws. And so they go out there, they see people experiencing homelessness, so much suffering, just, exponentially worse from the pandemic. They see that and they say, I'm going to go out there and make sure these people suffer more, And so I just, with the suffering, so I'm trying to think, what are they thinking to themselves? They're thinking, I'm suffering because I have to see that my city is no longer as pretty as it was, because the people that had to hide before to prevent being harassed by police for being poor, the people who were just thrown in jail constantly for being poor, they're now out in my vision, and that makes me uncomfortable. So I am suffering and I'm going to do something about it. And it's so upsetting to see that response, and that they got enough signatures. It is on the ballot. It will go up for a vote if we are going to recriminalize homelessness, if we are going to continue to punish people for being poor during a pandemic. It just, so that one really, created that in me of like, some of the suffering we just really need checked against the privilege. Because it's just, it's mind blowing how some people are responding to what they're seeing.
Yeah, and I think suffering can be one of those words that we misuse like other words in American life. I think we it would be very easy for us to all probably agree that what those people are complaining about is not suffering, right? They're using that word, but it's not that. And I think that distinction for us to be able to understand how we use language, and her being an author and trying to put these things into words is really important, because there's this whole mental health side of this that is very real and very legitimate for people in various ways, and we want to make sure that people are comfortable being able to get the assistance or the support that they need in this space. But we also need to recognize, Lauren, what you're saying, which is very, very toxic and real, is the misuse of suffering, or the misuse of the feeling of oppression, or the misuse of the feeling of, even we've seen like with words like racism, or like, well, now we hear, privileged white people saying, well, now racism's happening to me. And it's like, just because you use that word, it's not the same thing. And I think it's us truly understanding what this means for each other. And I think in the middle of a pandemic, that we've had this time to reflect and to be able to communicate to each other, but we still are sometimes not adequate enough in how we verbalize it to each other to help each other understand. And that's why communication, that's why this Reader Corner effort is so important. This is why our work in Texas is so important, to hear from everyone and then to be able to communicate to legislators, to tell them what the needs are, the solutions that we need, because there is this frustration. Sometimes it's uncomfortableness. Sometimes it's real just, having to endure the horrible things that they have to endure, and us understanding how to see these variations within all that. And so, yeah, a great essay that makes, like, every essay that we're going to be talking about that we were able to read just helps instigate so many different thoughts and conversations around what this is meaning. And I think her quote, which I don't have in front of me, that she starts with the book. She has two quotes to kind of open the book, and one of them is this: I have the ability to take notes and everything, but to not know what they mean or what to do about them, or some. I'm paraphrasing horribly, but makes me think of that as well. Okay, I think we're gonna, Lauren, you've got our next essay that we're gonna cover. Go for it.
Sure. So there's one called A Hovering Young Man. And there's a line in it that I feel like speaks so clearly to the work that we do. So I want to read some of it. Let's see. So she has lived long enough to see the social protections of her youth, which had not seemed to her dreams, but rather mundane realities: universal health care, free university education, decent public housing, all now recast as revolutionary concepts and thought of in America consistently by the right, but not infrequently by the left, as badges of radical leftism. What modest dreamers we have become. This just blew me away with recognition of the things that we are working for every day are such simple things that are labeled as radical that absolutely should not be. So I'm wondering if the group wants to identify some of the ways this connects to what we're advocating for with the Texas Lege group in our different huddle areas, and how interesting it is that we're seen as radical for wanting these things.
I guess I'll add that section that you just read comes pretty close to the end of the essay. And the very next paragraph, which is the closing paragraph, contrasts that woman in her 40s with this 20-something young millennial Cy, the hovering IT guy that she's writing about. And essentially what she's saying is that for them, the reality is they may not have seen those things in their lifetime, but they're dreamers and everything is possible. Which just tells me that in terms of the work that we do, we have allowed basic human decency to be recast as some radical leftist agenda. And instead of trying to continue to dictate the ways that young people get involved in the world around them, I kind of think we should probably be supporting how they want to get involved as long as they get involved. And yeah, so maybe it's not so important who my candidate of choice is as who those young people's candidate of choice is, because that's how they're going to stay motivated and do the work that needs to be done. I saw some facial expressions that I think need some unpacking. I don't know what I said. And I don't know if it was
thinking
good or
about
bad.
candidates. So thinking about candidates and who people decide have a good chance of winning and who would be really inspiring for communities and voices that are often not.
Who they would work for is what I'm getting down to, right? So I think if who young people, who marginalized people will work for are the people that I need to work for. That's kind of how my brain thinks about this.
Yeah, I kind of liked her comment, though, about people of Cy's age, the tech guy, their style, and she describes his style when she encounters him in the park and that sort of thing. But their style is all they have. And then she talks about the 40 or 48-year-old woman. But the thing that gets me about sort of where the older woman is what she's really talking about is how quickly things have, it goes back to some of the other comments made on the other essays in the book about how quickly things reverted to norm. So the norm being that a different form of healthcare, Medicare for all, universal, right to vote and so on. All it's reframed again, meaning it's reverted to the norm about how radical that seems. And so, I think it's right at the end of that essay where she thinks that achieving what is now again defined as radical is very, very difficult. The dreamer, like Cy, can afford to dream. That's his style. That's all he has. But the maturity of the older lady basically says it's tough. It's tough. And now we're reverting to norm and reviewing these kinds of things, which in a sense for a flash in time represented the inversion that we talked about before. Now they reverted to norm and all of a sudden they seem radical again.
Yeah, because it is the legislative session, I've been trying to craft my advocacy, like, oh, it's time to talk to your legislators about, good bills and bad bills. And I'm trying to do it Indivisible style with my personal story about how it affects me. And some of this stuff just feels ridiculous. Like, do you really need a personal story about why it's important to me to have reliable electricity in my home? Like, can we just agree that this is a baseline?
They can't. That's the challenge. They can't. And similar to, a comment that you made on one of the previous essays where you said, we all know we're in this together. Not everybody wants to acknowledge we're all in this together. It is a fundamental difference of opinion or moral value or something.
Mm-hmm.
It's not that obvious, unfortunately. It's obvious to me, Vanessa.
Mm-hmm.
Well, people who don't want to acknowledge that we're all in this together are basically maintaining that because they don't want to break the caste system.
Mm-hmm.
That would be a crack in the caste system.
Mm-hmm.
To actually put yourself in the position of caring about other people in a public policy sense, all of a sudden breaks the caste system.
Right. And, and a lot of it's very individualistic. It's like, well, I need these kids out of my hair. I need them to go to school. Like, well, for that to work, somebody, your kid's teacher has to go to school and be exposed to COVID all day. And I mean, how's that going to work? You're like, I don't know. And I don't care. I just need these kids out of my hair,
Feels like we keep tying, and this is what's amazing about our essays and how much they connect with each other as she's going through each of these things. But it comes back to the first essay we talked about, the American exception, of how we've handled the pandemic, of what's motivated us to make the decisions through the pandemic, how our lieutenant governor is advocating for grandparents to sacrifice themselves for the economy. And what we're sitting here saying is that, look, we all want a robust economy. We all want to be able to have something to do so that we can provide for our families, but not at the expense of basic needs that we have as humans. Like right now, we have a society where electricity is a very important part to us having sustainable life. And so we cannot forego electricity, and we cannot be on the brink of 4 minutes and 37 seconds of our entire energy grid, falling apart and going into catastrophe, to where we have weeks or months without electricity in the state of Texas. Whatever decisions have been beneficial to the economy cannot be so beneficial in that regard that it completely devastates people, and suffering has to be spread across our state. And so Medicaid expansion that's happening today, the advocacy around that today, we have people advocating for public education to be much more supported and robust, the ability to vote, and have voting available to them so they can participate in our democracy. All of these basic things. And Vanessa, like with the immigration, like having, humane policies to where we are not racially profiling or, putting people, to where we see them as less than because they are trying to get to a better life, that they're trying to do the reverse of Cancun cruise, right? Trying to get to America to improve. And so it's just how she's tied all of this together, and how we are made to feel radical is something that we should just, in honesty, just reject and say, no, this is what the new dawn is. This is what the way forward is for all of us as a society. Sorry, I went a little ranty there. All right. Vanessa, did you have another thought you wanted to share before we?
No.
Okay. Our next one, I guess, which continues to tie us together, is called A Woman with a Little Dog. And she describes this building that she lives in this community, and this particular woman who participates in community engagement with this feisty dog. And everyone has known that in her eyes, the dog is so cuddly and safe. And they're like, no, I don't want to mess with this dog because it's always trying to bite us or whatever. He's very protective of his who he lives with and everything of this woman. And but throughout this story, we understand the different spaces we occupy within our community, and the different contributions we make. And there's this moment that she has at the end of the essay where this lady shares this statement is, thing is, we're a community and we got each other's back. You'll be there for me and I'll be there for you, and we'll all be there for each other, the whole building. Nothing to be afraid of. We'll get through this, all of us together. And on one side, I felt very sentimental to that thinking. It's like, yes, we are all in this together. We're a big human family. There's people I care about. I want to continue to advocate for things to be improved. But then I had this recoiling of that particular statement, because we are overly dependent on this notion of community. We're overly dependent on the amazing humanity of the everyday person, but we do not demand that from our leaders. We do not demand that from our elected officials. We do not demand that from our systems of government or our employers, or on and on, those people in power. And it's almost gets to where it's become perverse to force everyone to have to carry the burdens of all the ones around us, when we have a society and a government that is designed for us to be able to handle these big things by contributing the small portions we can contribute to it through taxes, through public service, through maybe some volunteering, but
large portions through taxes sometimes. Yeah. Alex.
but it's not designed for us to do all of it all the time. And I think so these are the two reactions I kind of had reading this. I'm interested to see what y'all's thoughts were about this.
I definitely hear that, the two sides of this. Something that connects to what we've talked about with the previous essays as well is I have this burning inside me that subconsciously every day I wake up thinking about how I can break down the individualist mindset in this country. I just, I think it's at the heart of so many of our issues that we've covered today. But that doesn't mean that I think that everything should operate in the way that it's been operating, through the disaster and things like that, where it's all, relying on your neighbor to help you get water, to shut your water off, to, figure out how to stay warm when it's 9 degrees outside and you have snow piled up and you don't have any source of heat. I think we have to have functioning government that provides the basics, which the radical idea with that is, access to good education, to healthcare, to housing, to good jobs, meaningful jobs. And then when we have that, we can create art, we can be in spaces together to talk about books. We can do all these things as a community and support each other when something goes wrong. But there has to be that base level first. Our government has to make sure that we have those things that we've never all had access to in this country. So yeah, I want to break down individualism, but first we need to make sure basic needs are met, and that's never happened here.
Given when the book was written and this quote was just read, to me it was aspirational. But the challenge is trying to actualize it. So at the time, under the previous administration, this comment was very much aspirational. But think about now, the united effort that's being made to both produce and distribute and vaccinate people on a massive scale as quickly as possible, that is actualizing what she was expressing. I mean, that maybe that it, you know, the way that the COVID response is being handled now is an illustration of how it's possible to come together and be together for each other. That's how it's expressed through government. So back when this quote was written, it was aspirational. I also kind of think that today you're seeing it actualized to the extent that human beings can actualize it through government. But the other thing, I think it's sort of a fanciful idea, because I keep thinking about this reverting to norm, and the way caste is almost like the impact, the effect of the moon on the tides. It's a very difficult thing to intervene with. And so it's always a struggle. It's always a struggle. And I think, was it not at the end of that essay where the author is less confident that we can actually pull this off together?
I really enjoyed this essay. I love the whole Barbara character description. I think all of us could imagine a Barbara in our own communities. Great writing here. What I found interesting, Kirk, at the end of this essay was that she told us this really profound comment from Barbara, like the last time the author saw her, because she was moving out of the community. I'm pretty sure that was the context of this, right? Like, she's basically saying, I had just stopped to let my little dog out to use the bathroom, and we were just getting in the car and driving away from the city entirely. Zadie Smith is leaving that community, probably going back to England is my guess, given some of the other writing that's happening in there. But I loved being able to think of who this person is, being able to understand that community is not just built on depth of knowledge of people, but sometimes on the little tiny behaviors and the ways that we interact with each other. And, to your point, Alex, I think that sometimes it is difficult for us as really knee-deep progressive activists to look at amazing, beautiful examples of organic community and say, yes, it's great, but now somebody is going to say that this should be a substitute for infrastructure and social policy, right? And I feel like that's the hardest part about feeling like jaded about all of this, is that I can't just appreciate the community for what it is without fearing that it's going to be used as a weapon against our society to say, well, this is why we don't need more regulation. This is why we don't need better laws to protect people. Like, I get that. I get that fear. I get that fear.
All right. Any other thoughts before we go to our last essay? All right. Well, we're going to jump into postscript contempt as a virus. And I feel like the way these books, the last two books we've read together, Cast and Intimations, and how they had touch points with each other, is one of those serendipitous things that happen when you read books, or you even if you're watching films, or just different things, and how the overall human story that you're trying to understand and how they can be connected within various works is pretty amazing. And she goes on to talk about different elements of the caste system, like class, and then she talks about, racism with George Floyd, and she talks about caste in England and how they handle different things. But she has three questions that I thought were just amazing in the middle of this, or towards the end of this essay. Was, has America metabolized contempt? And just the phrasing of that question, I thought, was just amazing to do. Has it lived with the virus so long that it no longer fears it? And this, once again, is not the COVID virus, but contempt as a virus. Is there a strong enough desire for a different America within America? Going back to that new dawn that was at the beginning of the book. And I think these are the three questions that we wrestle within our work. We wrestle within our personal lives, probably because of who we are and the work that we are willing to do. And I would just love to get y'all's thoughts as we finish this conversation around these three questions that she poses within her last essay.
Well, to take the first question, has it metabolized contempt? My response to that is it long ago metabolized contempt. It has metastasized contempt. So it's not new, is what I'm saying. One of the interesting things about it is that contempt is different from hatred. Hatred is actually a recognition of you. Contempt is not. And so you see manifestations of what amounts to pure contempt, which I have characterized as, Ted Cruz being the walking embodiment of contempt. Mm-hmm. And she writes a line in there that, and this is a reflection of that kind of contempt: you do not represent capital, and therefore you do not represent power. Mm. And that's, to me, sort of gets at the heart of it. And we've lived with it so long that no one fears it. Well, I think a lot of people do fear it, actually. But it's a struggle. It's an ongoing, it'll probably be an everlasting struggle, actually. And is there a strong enough desire for a different America within America? It's a matter of will. It's a contest of wills. And between those who have contempt, who practice contempt, and those who, want a different paradigm. And that gets to the work that TX Lege is doing, and a host of other organizations are doing, that they do have the will to try to change it.
Thinking about that last question for me, I definitely believe that, yes, there is a strong enough desire for a different America within America, but I think there's a really important piece that needs to change. There are so many different types of people, different groups that believe different things, that vote certain ways. And I think there are a good amount of people that we might identify as, being on our side, our group. But there are a lot of people who are just trying to survive. They can't think about volunteering. They can't think about the importance of voting. when they are starving, when they don't have a home. Like there are so many things since we don't have that foundation of giving people access to healthcare, to education, to food, to housing, it leaves so many people out that, would want to be a part of creating a new America, but they are just surviving. So I think those of us who have access, who have the privilege of, having homes, having some level of security where we can make the time to do this, we have to do it. We have to get to that base level so that more people can get beyond just survival and have more of a role in creating that completely different country that we've ever had.
I think rather than addressing the 3 questions, I wanted to share that the most surprising thing to me was how Zadie Smith ended the book and ended this essay, which is she doesn't think it's possible. That sat with me for a long time. She doesn't think it's possible for America to change. That still sits with me. I still don't even know what to say about that.
I guess I'll just say, Antoinette, I have to believe that it's possible. Otherwise we'll give up, right? We can't give up. Yeah. Even if it's not possible, we still can't give up.
Vanessa, I want to check with you if you had any thoughts you wanted to share.
Yeah, the questions about contempt really made me think about asylum seekers. I don't know if you guys saw, but Governor Abbott's been trying to make some political hay out of claiming that, Biden's letting in illegal immigrants and they're spreading COVID. And that is, trying to distract from his repeal of the mask mandate, which I think was to distract us from the failures of the electrical grid. So create a problem and then blame brown people, because President Biden has started to, fix the logjam of asylum seekers, and some of them are actually successfully getting, being admitted into the country. And by the way, seeking asylum is legal. And they are being tested for COVID before they're let in. And even if we believed that they are bringing COVID, wouldn't we want everyone to wear masks more? And it was just like, that is such, to me, that was just so contemptuous. People who are fleeing violence and we're going to, and are not spreading COVID, and we're going to blame the problems on them instead of on our state's governor who just repealed the mask mandate. If anybody's spreading COVID, it's that. But I don't know. That just seemed like the epitome of contempt to me.
Yeah, I think for me, it's that was tough to swallow her feeling in her last line of this, Antoinette, like you mentioned. I'm very much with you, Lauren, though. I have to continue to operate like we can, and that's my do something so I can something to do, right? And thinking about the struggles or the obstacles that my daughters are going to have, and knowing that there's going to be a lot, but trying to see if there's a way to limit them as much as possible. And Kirk, when you mentioned the actualization of like the distribution of vaccines and how different it is versus, how she was saying it before, in that last essay we were talking about, for us in Texas, we have a state government right now that has a trifecta of Republican leadership, and that Republican leadership, unfortunately, is hell-bent on doing everything they can for business corporations and what they think is going to be the strongest form of the economy they can create. And with that, so much gets sacrificed. like a reliable electric grid, like healthcare for Texans, voting rights, and things like that. And I think for us in Texas, while we'll continue to work and we'll continue to advocate the legislature, and we have an opportunity to really move to make things happen. Like there is a real opportunity for Medicaid expansion because of all of the different things that are coming together. And so the work happening today is amazing. And there's an opportunity for some things to pass that we can shoot for this legislative session. But at the same time, we also know that there's a real chance for bad things to pass. And there is a real opportunity for things like voting restrictions to pass. And when we look at our administration at the federal level, and we see that example of the vaccine rollout, there's going to be enough vaccines at the end of May, and they just need to be distributed at that point and continue to do that. That's all encouraging news. But that's why that we need our fellow advocates who are working at the federal level to ensure that they are doing everything they can, because Texas, unfortunately, is going to continue to do some damaging things. And so when HR1 passes for voting rights and things like that, it needs to get over the finish line. It needs to get through the Senate. It needs to get signed by the president to offset anything that's going to try to happen in Texas. We need, $15 minimum wage. We need, all these other things to be solved so that we can hopefully continue to make ground within Texas to change it, to help it change for the better. And so just how we have this interconnectedness in our lives, and how, ultimately this book's reflection on how we are all impacted and connected with something as big as a pandemic. We are in a moment of time where there's a real possibility there's some good things that can happen for that new dawn. And we're going to do everything we can at the state legislature to pass some of those good things, to try to stop some of those bad things. But it's going to require work at multiple levels, even at the city council, the school board, the county level. All this kind of work needs to be done. And that's really the hope that Texans can see, is like, you've got to take action. You've got to be a part of this. You've got to jump in, because there are multiple levels to this that need to be solved. And if we stay individualistic and don't participate and don't engage, then we're at risk of not taking advantage of the time and the opportunity we have right now in the present. And so
the way you've expressed this, Alex, is consistent with my thinking about this. I think the way the author wrote those last few lines, she made achieving herd immunity a binary choice. She didn't think it was possible. But I think the other way, frankly, the herd immunity would put us at a point at which we are all immune from contempt and a whole lot of other things, okay? But I prefer to look at it like it's the striving that makes the difference, and or actualization that makes the difference. And I always work on the basis of nothing ever stays the same. So a permanent state of no immunity is just a non-starter for me. So it's a matter of striving. And I was reading through that HR1 last night on the Brennan Center, and the scope of that is just awesome. And if that's not striving toward not necessarily herd immunity, but striving to be a better society, I don't know what is. And so I would take exception with the author about it being a binary choice. I don't think it is. I mean, I would agree if you took her literally, if you're trying to meet that very high standard of actual herd immunity with respect to contempt, that's an extremely high standard. But I think in a practical sense, there's a whole lot of striving that can go on and move the needle in dramatic ways all the time through the kind of efforts you were describing, Alex.
Well, this has been a fascinating conversation to have with all of you. And this goes to show no matter the book, small or large, there are so many things that you can um, learn from, glean from, discuss with others when there's an amazing author behind it and really working to try to put the thoughts and emotions into text. And so a huge shout out to Zadie Smith for the amazing work that she did with this book and taking the moment to really capture where she was at within this point of the pandemic and being able to have a chance to reflect on it while unfortunately we are still in the midst of the pandemic. And so thank you everybody for being a part of this. I want to just give one final chance of any last comments anybody wants to make. Feel free to jump in and make some last comments. Any takers?
Read it. Read it.
Yeah, read it. And thank you, Alex, for hosting as usual.
Oh, no problem. The good work was done by being read, and just this is an amazing group to be a part of. And so this is a one final plug. If you want to join Indivisible TX Lege, visit our website, indivisible-textlege.org. We have a join us link. Follow us on social media, join our mailing list. But if you want to be a part of this organizing team that is, I get amazed by every day because of the amazing people we get to work with and trying to, strive, as Kirk said, for that better and brighter future in Texas. It is a real privilege to be able to be in this space with everybody that is in it. Thanks everybody for your time. Read it, like Antoinette said, and Lauren, and we'll catch up with you guys next month.
Thanks for joining, everyone.
Bye. Thanks, Alex.
Bye.
See you.